sometimes injustice comes at us wearing a badge. For Special Agent Trina Daniels of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, that moment came at 2:15 p.m. on Thursday, at a rest stop on Interstate 40, when officers Clyde, Falner and Rusk decided she looked like an easy target. They believed they could easily overpower Trina. They had no idea who they were harassing, nor did they realize that the woman they were about to arrest was an FBI agent who had been investigating human trafficking operations for the past 6 months. But they would learn this the hard way. Their grave mistake would cost both officers dearly. Trina pulled her black Freightliner semi-truck into the rest stop. 6 months of surveillance, weeks of pattern analysis, hundreds of hours spent crafting the identity of an independent long-haul truck driver named Keisha Lorne. Everything had led to this rest stop, this route, this specific time window when human trafficking vehicles passed through like clockwork. Trina was a consummate professional. She always examined everything down to the finest detail and prepared accordingly. She reached behind the driver's seat and grabbed the shipping manifest clip. She acted as if she did this all the time. She had to be natural. She couldn't give anything away. There were 3 more semi-trucks parked haphazardly in the lot. Inside a Tennessee-plated minivan, a tired mother was dragging her 2 children toward the restroom. And there were 2 Sheriff's Department patrol cars parked in the shade on the east side of the building. The occupants were invisible behind the dark-tinted windows. A strange feeling stirred within Trina. The patrol cars shouldn't have been here. Local law enforcement was supposed to stay out of the area during the surveillance period. The FBI headquarters had coordinated with the county sheriff to ensure no interference with the operation. She wondered how these patrol cars could possibly be here. The entire operation would be compromised. So why had 2 deputy sheriffs parked at the spot where the target vehicle was expected to arrive in about 12 minutes? She asked herself this question over and over. While appearing to conduct routine security checks, she flipped through the cargo manifest pages, counting down in her mind. The steady hum of the FBI tactical channel came through his earpiece, disguised as a simple Bluetooth device any trucker could wear. Agent Reeves at the mobile command center 2 miles away. Agent Chen monitoring from a surveillance van disguised as a delivery truck, and Sai Morrison overseeing from the field office. "The target vehicle is 17 minutes away," Chen whispered. He said everything's going according to plan. Trina pressed her thumb twice against the communication device. This was the copy that signal. She had to be careful. Just then she heard the sound of approaching boots. Well, let's see what's going on here," the police officers said as they approached her. There was a false sense of friendliness in their voices, and this immediately triggered Trina's threat assessment instincts. When she turned around, she saw a deputy sheriff strutting toward her, his thumbs hooked into his belt loops, a mocking smile on his red face. In his mid-40s, overweight, he moved with the easy arrogance of someone who'd never faced the consequences of abusing his authority. Trina had already done her preliminary analysis and had already calculated that trouble was coming. Thanks to her training, she was good at analyzing people. According to the name tag on his uniform, he was Deputy Sheriff Rusk. He wasn't on the FBI's radar. He had no connection to the human trafficking investigation. He was just a local law enforcement officer who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Good day, officer," Trina replied. "I'm checking my paperwork before hitting the road," she said, trying to defuse the situation. She didn't want any trouble. Otherwise, the operation she'd been working on for so long would be jeopardized. "I don't see many female truck drivers around here," Rusk said, sizing her up from head to toe. Trina realized it was already too late. All she wanted was to get out of this situation as soon as possible. Even though she hated being judged by her appearance, she had to stay calm. The insult wasn't spoken aloud, but it was crystal clear. Being subjected to this kind of discrimination because of her gender or skin color was hard to bear. But Keisha Lorne would defuse the situation. She would act professionally and try to smooth things over before things got any worse. "I have all the necessary licenses and documents," Trina said. "Commercial driver's license, DOT medical card, current insurance, all my records are up to date," she defended herself. In contrast to Rusk's swaggering stride, a second set of footsteps approached from behind, measured and resolute. Trina turned and saw another deputy emerging from the shadow beside the building, taller, thinner, scrutinizing her with cold eyes and a calculated intensity. This gaze was somehow more threatening than Rusk's obvious aggression. Deputy Sheriff Clyde Falner. She recognized him from security camera photos, but seeing him in person sent a chill down her spine, despite the afternoon heat. This was the man the Bureau suspected of running a human trafficking ring across 3 states. He was an officer who had drawn attention due to numerous missing persons cases, suspicious stops, and behavioral patterns, indicating systematic involvement in organized crime. Trina realized she was onto something, and there he stood, 15 feet away, studying her like prey. This is a rest stop, not a parking lot, Falner said. How long do you plan to linger here? He asked. I'm not lingering, sir, Trina replied. Her training was screaming warnings at her, but she forced herself to ignore them. In her ear, Morrison's voice came over the tactical channel. Daniels, what's your status? He asked. Trina couldn't respond. She couldn't acknowledge it. She could do nothing but stand there. The two deputy sheriffs had taken up positions in a textbook containment formation. Rusk in front, Falner circling toward her blind spot. Both were controlling angles and exits like hunters who'd rehearsed this choreography countless times before. Trina was fully aware of the whole damn situation. She knew exactly what could happen to her at the slightest sudden movement. Security check, Rusk growled, his previous feigned friendly demeanor vanishing instantly. Are you sure you didn't leave anything else in that truck? There's a lot of suspicious activity around here. Drugs, stolen goods, illegal immigrants. You don't know anything about that, do you? Rusk asked accusingly. A small crowd was gathering near the rest stop building. A mother with her children had stopped to watch. Most importantly, a young girl had pulled out her phone and in a universal gesture, raised it into the air to record what was happening. Good, Trina thought. Document everything. Because a voice inside her was telling her that things would turn sour very quickly. My papers are in order, she said in a sharp voice, pulling her commercial driver's license from her wallet and holding it out to Rusk. You can check everything. I have nothing to hide, she said. Oh, we'll check everything, said Falner, closing in close enough to invade her personal space in an attempt to intimidate her. He grabbed her wrist, his grip was deliberately painful, and twisted it slightly as he snatched the license from her hand. He calculated the interventions Trina might make based on her tactical training, but she couldn't reveal her identity. She couldn't jeopardize the operation, not with so much at stake. Instead, she pressed her thumb against the communication device in her ear. 2 quick taps, then 3, then 2 again. It was the emergency protocol. A distress signal. She needed backup. Sir, you're hurting my wrist, she said loudly. The reason she spoke so loudly was to ensure the young woman recording the incident could hear her. I showed you my license. There's no reason for this, he said. Shut up, Rusk shouted, stepping close enough for her to smell the stale coffee on his breath. More phones had appeared in the crowd. A mother was filming. An old man by a pickup truck had pulled out his camera. Evidence was piling up in real time. But Trina knew that videos didn't always protect people who looked like her. Falner's firm grip on her wrist pressed into pressure points with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to inflict pain without leaving visible marks. Maybe we should conduct a full search, he suggested. Let's see what that van is really carrying. Unless, of course, you don't want to tell us who you're working for, Falner added. Trina's heart was racing, but she kept her expression neutral. They were trying to provoke her into giving them a reasonable justification for a search they couldn't legally justify. Did they suspect she was law enforcement? Or was this standard procedure for black truckers who dared to be in areas these officers considered their territory? I'm working on my own, Trina said. I haven't done anything wrong and you have no reasonable cause to search me, she replied. In her ear she heard Morrison's sharp, anxious voice. Daniels, we're hearing the situation is escalating. Hold your position. The backup team is on its way. But the backup team was 2 miles away, and the situation was getting worse by the second. Reasonable cause, Falner repeated, staring at Trina with cold eyes. That's a pretty fancy legal term for a trucker. Where did you pick up words like that? Do you have a lawyer on your speed dial? Is there someone teaching you how to resist legitimate law enforcement? He began asking. The trap was closing. Every answer she gave would be twisted, every word used against her, and any attempt to defend her rights would be labeled as resistance or aggression. No matter what Trina did, everything was working against her. I know my rights, Trina said. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. A reasonable cause or consent is required, but you have neither, she replied. Rusk laughed. Look at this. Now she thinks she's a lawyer. You always have to make things difficult, don't you? He asked sarcastically. A few people in the crowd shifted uneasily, but no one intervened. No one stepped forward to challenge the officers who were clearly abusing their authority, because they were afraid of getting hurt. Just then, Falner's radio crackled. An operator's voice came through, professional and clear. All units near the 47-mile marker. There's a 10 to 50 incident with injured parties. I'm requesting immediate response, he said. A traffic accident with injured people. It was a priority call that both officers should have rushed to assist with. Without responding, Falner turned off his radio. He was acting as if he specifically wanted to deal with Trina. Has something like this ever happened to you? If so, how did you react? After Falner's action, Trina's blood ran cold. He had just ignored an emergency call. Aren't you going to respond to this? Trina asked. There's a situation here that needs to be handled first, Falner replied. He had clearly made it clear to Trina that he intended to cause her trouble. Chen's voice in Trina's ear. The target vehicle just passed the 3rd checkpoint. Estimated time of arrival is 7 minutes. Daniels said you need to clear that area. She couldn't speak to confirm it. With Falner's hand still gripping her wrist, Rusk blocking her path to the truck, and a crowd of witnesses who would film everything but couldn't stop what was about to happen, she could do nothing but stand there. "Let's try this again," Falner said. "You can cooperate and tell us what you're really doing here, or we can handle this the hard way. The choice is yours," he warned in his own way. But Trina had enough experience to realize she was being threatened. Before Trina could respond, Rusk moved with surprising speed, grabbing her other arm and pulling it behind her back. The movement caused Trina considerable pain. "She's resisting arrest," Rusk said. He shouted loudly so the recording phones could hear him and see him as justified. Knowing that what he was doing was wrong, he thought he could exonerate himself this way. "I'm not resisting anything," Trina protested, but Falner was already pulling her other arm back. Metal handcuffs appeared in his hands with expert efficiency. The handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. They were deliberately too tight and misaligned, so the metal dug into her bone. Trina's training screamed at her. She could break this hold, incapacitate the two officers before they realized what was happening, and finish this in 3 seconds. But ending it now would mean revealing her identity. It would mean jeopardizing 6 months of work. It would mean the human trafficking ring breaking up before the FBI could act. Since the entire operation would be at risk, she let a police officer treat her that way without doing anything. "Search the van," Falner ordered Rusk. "I'll interrogate him," he said. At that moment, a voice rang in his ear. It was Morrison, and his tone was angry. "Cancel the operation. Daniels, your cover's blown. The target vehicle has veered off course. They knew we were here. Get out of there immediately." Those words hit him like physical blows. His cover was blown. He was in danger. 6 months of work were ruined. And there he stood, handcuffed, unable to respond, unable to move. The human trafficking vehicle he'd been tracking was driving away, carrying its cargo of stolen lives. Falner grabbed her shoulder and shoved her toward the patrol car with unnecessary force. "Let's go to the station and have a nice little chat," he said, his warm breath brushing against her ear. "Let's see if we can figure out what you're really after." As Falner pushed her toward the police car, Trina's boots scraped against the asphalt. Through the crowd, she saw the girl whose phone was still recording, the mother clutching her children tightly, the old man shaking his head but doing nothing. That's how things went. Corrupt officials got away with it, just like that. In broad daylight, right before witnesses' eyes, knowing their badges protected them and the victims had no recourse. But Trina Daniels was no victim. She was a federal agent backed by the full force of the FBI, and Deputy Sheriffs Falner and Rusk had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. When Falner opened the back door of the patrol car and shoved her inside, Trina took one last look at her pickup truck. The vehicle containing 6 months' worth of surveillance equipment, documented evidence, and recorded proof related to a human trafficking operation that included these officers. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd intimidated and silenced yet another victim. They were unaware of the storm about to break over them. The back door slammed shut, and Trina, her hands sat in the suffocating heat of the police car, watching Falner and Rusk's truck approach through the window. In her ear, Morrison's voice was calm despite his obvious anger. "We've got a line of sight. We're recording everything. Hang in there, Agent Daniels. This isn't over." No, Trina thought, watching Falner's smug expression as he prepared to search his pickup truck. This was just the beginning. Officer Falner drove with one hand on the steering wheel and the other casually resting on his service weapon, a deliberate display of control, while the vinyl seats of the police car clung to Trina's skin. Officer Rusk sat in the passenger seat, periodically turning around to give her a sly look with the satisfaction of someone who relished having power over another person. "I bet you're not that tough anymore, are you?" Rusk asked mockingly, his face flushed with a kind of pleasure derived from cruelty. "You were so cool at the rest stop. Look at you now. You're nothing more than an ordinary criminal heading to the city." Trina remained silent, focusing on the road behind them through the rear window. Using the patrol car's bumpy motion as an excuse, she slid her handcuffed hands toward her ankle while mentally mapping out their route. A backup communication device was attached there, smaller than the headset Falner had already discovered and crushed under his boot, but functional enough to transmit a GPS signal that would allow the FBI to track her location. As her fingers brushed the top of her boot, Falner's cold voice tore through the car's interior. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Trina froze. Her eyes were locked on him through the rearview mirror, tracking his every move with the predatory awareness of someone who'd done this countless times before. "Whatever you're reaching for," he continued, his tone carrying a kind of silent threat that was somehow more menacing than Rusk's obvious aggression. "Stop immediately. Put your hands where I can see them." She slowly lowered her hands to her lap. The handcuffs dug painfully into her wrists. Through the window she watched the rest stop disappear behind them, watched the truck shrink into the distance. Inside that vehicle were 6 months of work and evidence that would bring down a human trafficking operation spanning 3 states, and he was being driven away from there by the very men he was investigating. Falner suddenly pulled the patrol car to the side. Gravel crunched under the tires as he turned onto a rarely used back road. Alarm bells began ringing in Trina's mind. This wasn't the road leading to the county sheriff's station. This was the kind of place where isolated, empty, and unwitnessed incidents occurred. Before she could grasp what this meant, Falner reached the back door and flung it open with force. His hands, with practiced efficiency, grabbed Trina's ankle, and with the speed of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for, he located the backup communication device. "Well, let's see what we've got here." He held the small black device up, examined it with cold interest, then crushed it between his fingers as if it were made of paper. "You never learn, do you?" He leaned in close enough for his warm breath to touch her face. His voice dropped to a whisper that held far more threat than a shout ever could. "If you make another smart move like that, you'll leave here in far worse shape than when you arrived. Got it?" The threat hung in the air like smoke. Trina met his gaze with determination, refusing to show him the fear he was looking for, though she understood the message all too well. They were alone on a deserted road. No witnesses, no cameras, just 2 corrupt deputy sheriffs and a helpless handcuffed woman they believed to be defenseless. They had no idea that every word was being recorded by the button-sewn cameras on their shirts, that FBI surveillance teams were tracking the patrol car's movements, or that SAC Morrison had already activated emergency protocols to bring the full weight of federal law enforcement down on this county. But for now, she had to play her part. Until the FBI rescued her safely, she had to be the frightened and powerless Keisha Lorne. "I understand," she said quietly, adding just enough fear to satisfy him, while preserving the dignity that even Keisha Lorne would never fully surrender. Falner studied her for a long moment, then slammed the door shut hard enough to rattle the patrol car. He climbed back into the driver's seat and pulled away again, this time driving at a higher speed that conveyed a sense of urgency. They passed the rest stop again, a deliberate route that made no sense unless Falner wanted to check something. Trina's heart sank when she spotted a black cargo truck pulling out of the parking lot. It was the vehicle she'd been tracking for weeks. The truck she'd identified during her surveillance as part of a human trafficking ring. She couldn't see the cargo through the tinted windows, but she knew what was inside. Young women, stolen lives, being transported to destinations where they would vanish into nationwide exploitation networks. All her meticulous work, months of building a cover identity, identifying surveillance patterns, and documenting evidence, had all gone to waste in an instant, because 2 corrupt deputy sheriffs had decided to harass her. In her shirt pocket, the button camera kept recording. The FBI would obtain these recordings. They would document the existence of the human trafficking vehicle, the suspicious timing, and the coordination that showed Falner and Rusk's harassment was by no means random, but a deliberate tactic to disrupt surveillance. The county sheriff's station finally came into view, likely modern in the 1970s, but now appearing worn and neglected. Falner parked in a side lot instead of the main entrance. This was another tactical choice to keep him out of public view. They let him inside through the back entrance. They avoided the main lobby, where citizens could see and cameras could record, and stayed away from where witnesses pushing him into his van might have questioned why a handcuffed woman had visible marks on her wrists and a cut on her lip. The holding area was strangely quiet for the afternoon. Only a few officers were visible, and those present looked away when Falner brought her in. Either they were complicit in the corruption taking place, or they had learned that asking questions about Falner's arrests was dangerous for their career advancement. The duty officer, a burly man in his 50s with tired eyes, looked up from his paperwork but didn't seem particularly interested. "Your name?" "Keisha Lorne," Trina replied in a calm voice, using her alias with the same confidence she'd maintained for the past 6 months. Her documents were flawless, her backstory solid, and her identity had been verified through dozens of legitimate interactions across multiple states. But Falner's eyes narrowed slightly. He leaned in and studied her face with an intensity that made her hair stand on end. "Strange," he said slowly. "You don't look like a Keisha to me." Trina met his gaze. "My mother gave me that name. Do you have a problem with my appearance?" It was a calculated risk, enough resistance to appear like an innocent civilian wrongfully arrested, but not so much as to confirm the doubts beginning to form in Falner's mind. "We'll see," Falner muttered. Shaking his head slightly, he turned to Rusk. "Put her in custody, cell number 3, alone." The jail cell was small and old, filled with the scent of industrial cleaning agents that couldn't fully mask the unpleasant odors lingering within. A single narrow bench, a toilet without a seat, and a very high small window that let in light but revealed nothing of the outside world. The heavy door slammed shut with a precision designed to crush spirits and make the prisoners feel the weight of their own helplessness. But Trina wasn't helpless. She was a federal agent backed by support, evidence, and the full authority of the FBI. The real question was how long she'd have to endure this charade before the Bureau took action. She sat on the bench, adjusted her position so the button camera could clearly see inside the cell, and documented the conditions, the isolation, and the deliberate intimidation tactics Falner employed as standard procedure. Through the small window in the door, he could see officers passing by from time to time. None made eye contact. None noticed his presence. The message was clear. He was alone, forgotten, at the mercy of men who answered to no one. But in reality, they were accountable to someone. They just didn't know it yet. An hour passed, then 2 hours. There was no food, there was no water. Despite her repeated requests, she was not allowed to make a phone call. Every legal procedure was violated, every right trampled upon, and all of it was recorded by a camera they were unaware of. Finally, footsteps approached. The door opened and Falner stepped out. Beside him was a man in a suit, moving with an air of authority that suggested he held a significant position within the local power structure. "Miss Lorne," the man in the suit began, his voice carrying the tone of a politician or high-ranking official. "I'm Sheriff Clayton Marks. Officer Falner has expressed some concerns regarding your documents and your activities in our county." Sheriff Marks, the man at the head of the department alleged to have coordinated to ensure law enforcement did not intervene during the surveillance operation. Either he had been left out of that coordination loop or he was in on it himself. The man heading the department alleged to have coordinated to prevent law enforcement from intervening during the surveillance operation. Either he had been left out of that coordination loop or he was in on it too. Trina was betting on the second option. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said firmly. "When your deputies harassed me, violated my Fourth Amendment rights and arrested me without probable cause, I was taking a legal break. I want to file an official complaint and speak with my attorney." Mark's smile was nothing but teeth and contained no warmth. "Now let's not rush things. I'm sure we can resolve this misunderstanding without lawyers or official complaints that could damage your reputation in the trucking community." The threat was subtle, but clear and unambiguous. "Play along or we'll make sure you can't work in this industry again." "I know my rights," Trina replied. "You need to grant me permission for a phone call. I'm requesting it now." Falner shifted slightly, his hand likely moving unconsciously toward his service weapon, but this movement revealed a tendency toward violence when authority was challenged. "Here's the thing, Keisha," said Marks, leaning against the doorframe with feigned ease. "We do things differently in this county. We believe in community policing. We believe in working together to keep our roads safe. Now, Deputy Falner here is one of our best. If he says something looks suspicious, we take it seriously." He paused, sizing her up with the same predatory gaze Falner used. "So why don't you tell us what you were really doing at that rest stop? Who were you meeting? What were you carrying? Help us out so we can help you." They were taking the bait. They were fabricating a story to justify the illegal arrest, searching for any confession they could twist into a reasonable cause after the fact. "I was checking my cargo manifest," Trina said in a calm voice. "I was conducting the safety inspections required by the DOT. Everything I did was legal and documented. Your officers had no grounds to stop, search, or arrest me." Marks's face hardened slightly. "You seem very familiar with legal terminology for a truck driver. Where did you learn to talk like that?" "From TV," Trina replied coolly. "That's where everyone learns their rights these days." An uncomfortable silence stretched on. Marks looked at Falner with an expression Trina couldn't quite read. Was it worry? Suspicion? A warning? "We'll have to impound your truck," Marks said finally. "Standard procedure for this kind of investigation. Assuming everything is in order, it might take a few days to get it back. Her truck, with all the surveillance equipment, all the documented evidence, all the proof of the human trafficking operation these men were running or protecting, or both. You need a search warrant for that," Trina said. "We already have it," Falner said, pulling folded papers from his pocket with a timing that seemed as though everything had been planned in advance. "Judge Henderson signed it an hour ago. There's reasonable suspicion due to your suspicious behavior and your resistance to a legitimate law enforcement investigation." Judge Henderson. Another name to add to the FBI's investigation. Corruption. It was going deeper than they'd anticipated. But Trina knew something these men didn't. The truck had a remote wipe feature. The moment the FBI detected unauthorized access, all surveillance equipment would erase its data, leaving only standard truck equipment and legitimate cargo behind. The evidence wouldn't be stored in a vehicle these corrupt officials could search and compromise would be protected on FBI servers, not in a vehicle. "I want our phone call," she repeated. "This isn't a request. It's a constitutional right you must uphold. Marks flashed that cold politician's smile again. Of course, we'll arrange that phone call for you, right after the procedures are completed. Considering how busy we are today, this might take a little time. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing, Kesha, or whatever your real name is, this county looks out for its own citizens. Deputy Falner and his colleagues are good men doing a tough job. Anyone who comes here trying to make them look bad to cause trouble, well, they usually find their lives get a lot harder. The threat was now clear. Back off, or face the consequences. Trina met his gaze without flinching. When reports of human rights violations in your department surface, I look forward to explaining all of this to my attorney and the federal investigators who will be involved in the case. Something flashed across Marks's face. Genuine concern, but it vanished quickly. Federal investigators, he repeated slowly. That's an interesting point. Where did you get the idea that federal investigators would get involved in a routine traffic stop in a small county? Because unlawful detention, violation of constitutional rights, and systematic harassment based on race and gender are federal crimes, Trina replied. And I'd bet I'm not the first person you've done this to. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Marks and Falner exchanged another glance. This time it carried a clear warning. Do your job, Marks finally said. Full search, full record. I want to know everything about Ms. Keisha Lorne. The door closed again, and Trina was left alone in the cell. But she wasn't alone. Somewhere outside, Essak Morrison and the FBI tactical team were springing into action. Agent Chen was watching the footage from the button camera. Federal prosecutors had already begun preparing their cases based on what had happened in the last 3 hours. And Deputy Sheriff Falner and Rusk, Sheriff Marks, Judge Henderson, and everyone else involved in this corruption had just committed multiple federal crimes in front of a federal agent equipped with recording devices they were unaware of. Trina held her breath as she leaned back on the bench, maintaining her role as Keisha Lorne. She cataloged in her mind every violation, every threat, and every piece of evidence that would ultimately lead to the collapse of this operation. They thought they had caught a lone, defenseless, and helpless truck driver. In reality, they had caught a federal agent with the patience to let them dig their own graves deeper with their documents, their support, and every illegal act they committed. She could hear voices outside the cell. Falner was on the phone. There was urgency in his tone, but the words were too muffled to make out clearly. Something had changed. Something had unsettled them. Good, Trina thought. Let them be nervous. Because the storm was coming, and when it arrived, it would sweep away every corrupt official who thought their badges meant immunity from justice. She needed to stay alive long enough to see that happen. 4 hours into her illegal detention, Trina heard footsteps approaching her cell. The sounds carried a resolve that suggested something had changed. The door opened, and Deputy Sheriff Falner appeared. But this time he wasn't alone. 2 other deputies were with him. Both moved with that stiff tension that comes from being ordered to do something they didn't feel comfortable with. Stand up, Falner ordered. The sheriff wants to speak with you again. Trina slowly stood up, her muscles stiff from the hours she'd spent on the hard bench. She noticed that none of the 3 deputy sheriffs made eye contact with her. Their body language suggested they were merely following orders rather than acting out the casual cruelty Falner and Rusk had previously displayed. Something had definitely changed. They led her through a corridor she hadn't seen during the booking. They passed by offices where deputy sheriffs were working at computers or talking on the phone. As Trina passed by, their conversations abruptly stopped. The sudden silence spoke volumes. The news of the arrest had spread, and whatever Sheriff Marks had discovered or suspected had transformed what had been a routine harassment into a situation that required careful handling. The interrogation room was exactly as Trina had expected, small, windowless, with a metal desk bolted to the floor and 2 chairs on either side. A camera mounted in the corner, its red light indicating it was recording. It was a standard setup, but she knew from experience that in departments like this, camera recordings tended to disappear when they documented misconduct. But the button camera was still recording. It was still streaming to FBI servers that these officers couldn't access or delete. Falner gestured to one of the chairs. Sit down. Trina sat down, maintaining her upright posture despite her fatigue and discomfort. Across from her, Falner settled into his chair with the confidence of someone who had conducted hundreds of interrogations in this room, breaking countless suspects through intimidation and psychological pressure. She didn't realize she was the one being interrogated. She didn't know that every word she spoke, every movement she made, and every tactical mistake she committed was being documented and analyzed by federal agents specialized in bringing down corrupt law enforcement agencies. The door opened again and Sheriff Marks entered. Beside him was a woman in a suit carrying a leather briefcase. She had the sharp gaze and careful movements of a lawyer, but it wasn't immediately clear whether she was representing the department or was there for another reason. "Miss Lorne," Marks began as he sat down in a chair brought over immediately by one of his young deputies. "This is Amanda Reese, our county legal counsel. She's here to ensure that everything we discuss is properly documented and legally valid." Trina noticed the carefully chosen words. Not protecting your rights or ensuring fair treatment, but ensuring everything is legally valid. This language was designed to protect the department, not the detainee. "I've been requesting a phone call for 4 hours," Trina said, directing her words not to the sheriff but to the attorney. "This is a violation of my rights under the 6th Amendment. Additionally, I haven't been provided with food, water, or access to a restroom. These conditions constitute cruel and unusual punishment under the 8th Amendment." A look of concern flashed across Attorney Reese's face, but he quickly returned to his professional neutrality. "These concerns will be addressed. But first, Sheriff Marks has some questions regarding your activities in our county." "I'm exercising my right to remain silent until I speak with my attorney," Trina replied. This was the correct legal response and a wise tactic. However, it also meant forgoing the opportunity to gather more evidence about what they knew, what they suspected, and what was troubling them enough to call for a lawyer. Marks leaned back in his chair and began looking at her with renewed interest. "You know, Ms. Lorne, I've been the sheriff of this county for 16 years. During that time, I've spoken to thousands of people, criminals, witnesses, victims, and I've become quite good at reading people." He paused, letting the silence linger. "You're not who you say you are. The real question is, who are you really? A police officer from another jurisdiction? A private detective? A federal agent?" This direct accusation hung in the air. Trina kept her expression neutral, neither confirming nor denying it, but her heart began to race. If they suspected she was actually a law enforcement officer, they could have taken drastic measures, like destroying evidence, alerting the criminal network, or worse. "I'm a licensed commercial truck driver," she said in a calm voice. "Everything regarding my background and documents is legitimate and verifiable. You detained me for 4 hours without any charges, without allowing me to consult a lawyer, and in the process violated numerous constitutional rights. This is not a legal procedure. This is harassment designed to intimidate me into confessing to crimes I didn't commit." Falner slammed his hand down on the table hard enough to make Attorney Reese flinch. "Don't play the innocent victim card with us. We found equipment in your truck that a regular trucker wouldn't have. Surveillance devices, encrypted communication tools, tactical gear. Care to explain that?" Trina's mind began racing. They had entered her truck without permission, illegally, without a proper search warrant, and without taking any precautions to prevent the remote security measures from triggering. This meant that the surveillance equipment should have self-destructed the moment they attempted unauthorized access. Unless, of course, they hadn't found anything before the self-destruct mechanism kicked in. Or if they were lying about what they discovered, hoping to provoke her into revealing information. "I want to see this equipment you claim to have found," Trina said. "I want to see the search documents, the search warrant records, the chain of custody paperwork. Because I know for certain there's nothing in my truck but standard shipping equipment in legal cargo." Marks and Falner exchanged a glance. Trina noticed this and took note of it. They were bluffing. They hadn't found anything, but panicking and hoping she'd reveal her identity, they were trying to convince her they had. "Here's what I think," said Marks, his tone shifting from conversational to more menacing. "I think you came to my county looking for something specific. I think you were watching someone or something at that rest stop, and I think Deputy Falner's instincts were right when he decided you needed a closer look." He leaned forward. "What I don't understand is, are you a cop operating outside your jurisdiction or something entirely different? A federal agent, perhaps? FBI? DEA? One of those alphabet agencies that thinks it can enter a local county and conduct an operation without notifying local law enforcement?" The questioning had become more focused. They didn't know for sure, but they suspected enough to be concerned. "I'm exercising my right to remain silent," Trina repeated, "and I'm officially requesting a lawyer. I have nothing else to say until my lawyer arrives." Attorney Reese cleared his throat. "Sheriff, perhaps we—" "Not yet," Marks cut him off, keeping his eyes fixed on Trina's face. "Miss Lorne here will help us understand something. Look, about 6 months ago we started noticing unusual activity in our county. Vehicles that didn't fit the usual pattern. People asking questions they shouldn't be asking. And I thought to myself, someone is running an operation here without telling me." He stood up and walked slowly in a circle around the table, clearly to intimidate. "Now, if you're law enforcement from another jurisdiction, that's a breach of courtesy. A serious matter, but something we can handle professionally. But if you're federal, and you're conducting an investigation in my county without coordinating with me, that's an entirely different matter." Trina remained silent, but her mind was weighing the possible consequences. Marks was very specific, very focused. He wasn't speculating, he'd been tipped off. Someone had informed him that federal investigators were operating in his county. That meant there was a leak somewhere, either in the FBI's coordination with local authorities or within the local department where someone loyal to Marks was passing on information about federal investigations. The interrogation room door burst open without warning. A deputy sheriff Trina had never seen before poked his head inside, his face flushed with urgency. "Sheriff, there's a problem. Federal agents are at the front desk and want to speak with you. They're claiming we've detained one of their own." The room fell completely silent. Expressions of shock, anger, and calculation flashed across Marks's face in rapid succession. "Federal agents," he repeated slowly. "Which agency?" "The FBI, sir. They have their badges and search warrants, and they're threatening to arrest anyone interfering with their investigation." Trina kept her face carefully neutral while smiling slightly to herself. Help had arrived. Sack Morrison had finally taken action, bringing the full weight of federal authority down on this corrupt department. "Tell them I'll be there immediately," said Marks, his voice strained with barely contained anger. He turned to Falner. "Stay with her. Don't let him contact anyone." As Marks and Attorney Reese hurried out, Falner stepped between Trina and the door, his hand resting on his service weapon in a now habitual motion. "You tricked us," he said quietly, studying her with cold eyes that held a newfound understanding. "All that innocent trucker act, but you were a federal agent from the start." "I didn't say that," Trina replied. "You didn't have to. The FBI doesn't show up with a search warrant unless one of their own is involved." Her jaw tightened. "There's something you need to know. Whatever you think you have, whatever you think you've documented, none of it holds up. We've been doing this for a long time. We know how to protect ourselves." "Really?" Trina asked, unable to resist now that this charade had essentially come to an end. "Did you tell that to the other 17 women whose complaints against your department mysteriously vanished, to the 4 young people who disappeared after being stopped at that rest stop, or the human trafficking victims whose cases were never properly investigated, even though their families filed missing person reports?" Falner's face darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm saying," Trina replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 6 months preparing a flawless case file. "I know the network. I know the transport vehicles. I know the coordination between your department and organized human trafficking operations spanning 3 states. And I know that every threat you've made in the last 4 hours, every right you've violated, every illegal act you've committed has been documented and forwarded to federal prosecutors with a keen interest in systematic corruption cases." Falner's face paled as he grasped the implications. "Were you recording this? Did you really think I'd come to investigate corrupt law enforcement without any protection?" Trina asked. "Everything from the rest stop until this moment. It's been documented, forwarded, and safeguarded beyond your ability to destroy or conceal it." Falner's hand reached for his gun, then froze at the sounds coming from the hallway. Voices belonging to people who wouldn't be intimidated by a small-town deputy sheriff with delusions of power. The interrogation room door opened, and inside appeared Sack Morrison, flanked on either side by 4 FBI agents in tactical gear, and having shown their credentials, their presence instantly and completely shifted the dynamics of the room. "Special Agent Trina Daniels," Morrison said in a formal tone. His voice carried a mix of relief and barely contained anger. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, sir," Trina replied, standing up as the agents entered the room with their usual efficiency. Morrison turned his attention to Falner, his expression as cold as ice. "Deputy Sheriff Falner, you are under arrest for the crimes of depriving individuals of their rights under the guise of the law, the unlawful detention of a federal officer, obstruction of justice, and attempted human trafficking. You have the right to remain silent." "This is nonsense," Falner cut him off, his voice rising with panic and anger.
"You was conducting an illegal investigation in our jurisdiction without notifying us."
"We notified Sheriff Marks 3 months ago," Morrison interjected. "We provided information regarding the scope of our investigation and requested cooperation. These notifications are documented and time-stamped. Your sheriff chose to ignore them and interfere with a federal investigation. That's a crime, officer. Actually, multiple crimes." 2 agents moved behind Falner, efficiently drew their service weapons, and handcuffed him behind his back. The man who had been so confident while harassing Trina now looked small and frightened as reality closed in on him. Sheriff Marks appeared at the door. His face was flushed with anger or shame or both. "This is my station." "Just like that. We can, and we are," Morrison replied, handing him a stack of papers. "Federal arrest warrants based on numerous charges against Deputy Sheriff Clyde Falner, Deputy Sheriff Rusk, and you, including conspiracy, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice. Additionally, supplementary warrants for the seizure of departmental records, computer systems, and evidence related to the human trafficking investigation that your department has systematically obstructed." He gestured toward the tactical team spreading out through the building. "We're also executing search warrants in Judge Henderson's office, at several local businesses linked to the human trafficking ring, and at Deputy Falner's home. You may call your attorney, Sheriff. I recommend you do so immediately. As the agents led Falner past her, Trina looked into his eyes one last time. The cold hunter who took pleasure in using force against someone he deemed helpless was now looking at her with an emotion bordering on fear. You really thought you could get away with it, she said quietly. Trafficking young women, ruining their lives, hiding behind your badges. But you didn't understand this. Justice doesn't stop just because you're wearing a uniform. It just takes a little longer to arrive. As the other agents examined the scene and documented everything for the upcoming investigation, Morrison approached. Agent Daniels, we need to take you for a medical exam and then question you. The footage from the button camera is already being analyzed. What they did to you. Evidence, Trina cut him off sharply. Document it. Use it. Make sure every violation, every threat, every illegal act becomes part of the case that will send these men to prison for decades. They jeopardized the human trafficking operation, Morrison said, a stern expression on his face. The transport vehicle you were tracking has gone missing. But we have 6 months of surveillance footage showing this operation, Trina replied. We have documentation for the 17 previous transports. We have statements from the escaped victims. And now we have records of corrupt law enforcement officers who obstructed the federal investigation. That's enough to take down the network even without catching today's transport. Morrison looked at her with a kind of assessment born of years of evaluating agents under pressure. You could have compromised your cover sooner. You could have identified yourself as the FBI and avoided illegal detention, and I could have lost the documentation of systematic human rights violations, Trina replied. These men have been doing this for years, Morrison. How many more people have they harassed, detained, threatened? How many victims remained silent because they thought no one would believe them against badge-wearing officers? The only way to stop them permanently was to let them commit a crime against someone who could document everything and bring federal charges they couldn't escape. Outside the station, news vehicles had already begun gathering following reports of the FBI's raid on the local sheriff's department, as agents while reporters shouted their unanswered questions. When Trina stepped out into the afternoon sun, she saw Deputy Sheriff Rusk being led away in handcuffs to a federal vehicle. His previous cocky demeanor had completely vanished. Behind him stood Sheriff Marks with his lawyer. The expression on both their faces suggested they were beginning to grasp the magnitude of the impending events. An agent approached Morrison to brief him on the latest developments. Sir, we've recovered the files that were deleted from the department's servers. It appears complaints against Falner and Rusk were systematically suppressed. 17 cases in just the last 3 years. 17 cases, 17 people whose complaints were covered up, whose suffering was ignored, and whose faith in justice was betrayed by those sworn to protect them. But not anymore, because Special Agent Trina Daniels had been illegally detained, threatened, and harassed for 4 hours, and throughout that entire time she had documented every crime, every confession, every piece of evidence that would ensure these corrupt officers could not escape the accountability they believed their badges would shield them from. As federal vehicles departed the sheriff's station to transport the arrested passengers to justice, Trina allowed herself to feel not the satisfaction of revenge, but from the satisfaction of the truth coming to light. They had thought they were arresting a helpless truck driver. In reality, they had arrested a federal agent with the patience to let them ruin themselves with their own paperwork, authority, and illegal actions. And now, spending years in a federal prison, they would learn what true powerlessness really felt like. The FBI field office's conference room was a sterile place compared to the heat and tension at the sheriff's station, but the anger contained within its walls was just as intense. Sack Morrison paced back and forth in front of a wall-sized screen displaying still frames from Trina's button camera. These images documented 4 hours of systematic human rights violations committed by officers who believed their badges made them untouchable. 17 previous complaints, said Morrison, his voice taut with controlled anger. 17 people reporting harassment, unlawful detention, and abuse by officers named Falner and Rusk. Every single complaint was dismissed by Sheriff Marks on the grounds that they were baseless. Most weren't even properly investigated. Trina, after a medical examination documenting her injuries, sat at the conference table having taken a shower and dressed in clean FBI tactical gear, wrists bruised from excessively tight handcuffs, a shoulder injured during a rough arrest, a lip split from being shoved into the van. Minor injuries in the bigger picture, but each one was a federal crime when inflicted without cause by law enforcement. Seated around the table was the team that had supported his covert operation for the past 6 months. Agent Chen, who had monitored the surveillance. Agent Reeves, who had coordinated tactical support. Federal prosecutor Jennifer Walsh, who had prepared the human trafficking case and now had to manage an additional corruption case. The footage from the button camera is devastating, Walsh said, reviewing her notes on her tablet. Clear evidence of unlawful detention, denial of constitutional rights, threatening behavior, and admissions of systematic civil rights violations. When combined with the deleted complaint files we recovered from their servers, we can prove the pattern of abuse and its practices that have been going on for years. What about the human trafficking ring? Trina asked, voicing the question that had been gnawing at her mind since the FBI raid. The transport vehicle I was tracking got away. Did we lose them? Morrison shook his head. You've been tracking that route for 6 months, documented the 17 previous shipments, identified the pattern and timing. The vehicle that escaped today is just one part of the network we're systematically dismantling right now. New images appeared on the screen, surveillance photos, license plates, identified suspects. Based on your intelligence and the evidence we seized from the sheriff's department, we conducted coordinated raids across 3 states this morning. The screen filled with arrest photos. Handcuffed men and women were being led away from various locations: a warehouse in Tennessee, a truck stop in Arkansas, an ordinary office building in Mississippi. 12 people have been arrested so far, Chen added. Among them are the owner of the transport company, 3 drivers, 4 intermediaries, and 2 local officials providing protection. The network is collapsing. Trina felt a weight lift from her chest. 6 months of work hadn't been in vain. The human trafficking operation that had ruined so many lives was being dismantled, even if they hadn't managed to intercept today's shipment. We also found 4 victims, Reeves reported quietly. The young women held in the warehouse we raided in Tennessee. They're currently receiving medical care and victim services. 2 of them have already agreed to testify about how the human trafficking occurred and who was involved. 4 lives were saved. 4 families were reunited. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough while so many remained missing, but it was something concrete and real. Walsh opened a new document. The charges against Falner, Rusk, and Marks are extensive. Deprivation of rights under the guise of the law, conspiracy to obstruct justice, making false statements to federal investigators, destruction of evidence. Specifically for Falner, we're adding the charge of conspiracy to commit human trafficking based on evidence that he actively provided protection to a human trafficking ring in exchange for payment. What kind of prison sentence are we looking at? Trina asked. If Falner is convicted on all charges, he'll face at least 20 years in prison, Walsh replied. If we can prove that his direct involvement in human trafficking led to the victims' deaths or serious bodily harm, he could likely face life in prison. Rusk and Marks, meanwhile, each face 15 to 20 years in prison. Additionally, our investigation into Judge Henderson and other officials who may have been involved in suppressing complaints and obstructing investigations is ongoing. In the weeks that followed, the case expanded as more evidence emerged and more victims found the courage to speak out. 17 people whose complaints were dismissed by Sheriff Marks came forward to testify about harassment, illegal searches, planted evidence, and threats made to silence them. Trina spoke with several of them during witness preparation sessions. She listened to their stories, which mirrored her own experiences, but the consequences were devastating because the victims lacked the federal badges and support needed to protect themselves. Marcus Chen, a black truck driver who was pulled over at the same rest stop 3 years earlier and arrested on fabricated drug charges, lost his commercial driver's license and his livelihood while fighting the charges Falner had fabricated. The charges were eventually dismissed, but only after Marcus had served 6 months in jail and lost everything he had built. Rosa Martinez, a Latina woman whose teenage daughter went missing after being pulled over by Rusk for a traffic violation. The sheriff's department claimed they had released her daughter at the rest stop, but the girl never made it home. Rosa filed a missing person report and requested an investigation, but was told she was acting hysterically and that her daughter had likely run away. The girl's body had been found 8 months earlier in a shallow grave 30 miles from the rest stop. The case remained officially unsolved, but evidence seized from Falner's home indicated that he was involved in her death after she resisted human trafficking. Trina sat beside Rosa at the Victim Services office and held the woman's hand as she gave the testimony that would ensure Falner spent the rest of his life in prison. They told me I was crazy, said Rosa, tears streaming down her face. They said my daughter had run away, that I was wasting the police's time, that I should accept she was gone and move on with my life. But they knew from the very beginning what had happened to her. They knew, and they covered it up. I'm so sorry, Trina said. Her words felt inadequate but necessary. What happened to your daughter was a crime, and those responsible will be held accountable. I promise you. Rosa looked at her, her eyes red. When I saw the news about you, when I saw what they did to you and how the FBI arrested them, I thought maybe finally someone would listen to me. Maybe finally someone would care. We care, Trina assured her. Every victim, every complaint, every person they've harmed, they all matter. And all of this will be part of the case that ensures they never harm anyone again. The media coverage was relentless. As the scale of the corruption became clear, local news turned into national news. Headlines screamed about federal raids that had exposed a network of systematic human trafficking. corrupt law enforcement, and a ring that had operated with impunity for years. Trina's identity as an undercover FBI agent was initially protected, but eventually the story leaked. Body camera footage edited to protect operational security, yet still showing illegal detentions and abuse, was released to media outlets as part of the public prosecution. The backlash was immediate and massive. Civil rights organizations demanded that rural police departments be subject to federal oversight. Members of Congress introduced bills requiring independent investigations into complaints against law enforcement. Across the country, victims of police harassment, encouraged by the prospect of accountability, began sharing their own stories. The trial began 8 months after Trina's arrest and was held in federal court under security measures reflecting the high-profile nature of the case. Officer Clyde Falner faced a jury of his peers, though in this context, peers meant ordinary citizens, not fellow police officers who might be inclined to protect one of their own. Federal prosecutor Walsh methodically built his case over 3 weeks of testimony. Body camera footage was played from start to finish. It showed every moment, from Falner's initial harassment at the rest stop through the subsequent unlawful arrest, threats, and violations. Expert witnesses testified on proper law enforcement procedures and how Falner's actions deviated from every standard and protocol. FBI agents described the human trafficking ring and Falner's documented role in providing protection. Victims took the stand one after another, recounting their experiences with a deputy sheriff who used his badge as a weapon against defenseless people. Marcus Chen testified about his arrest, ruined career, and the 6 months he spent in jail fighting fabricated charges. Rosa Martinez testified about her daughter's disappearance and death, the sheriff's department's refusal to investigate, and evidence showing Falner's role in the incident. Trina testified for 2 days, explaining to the jury her 6-month undercover operation, detailing how she documented the human trafficking ring's operations, and describing in medical detail what Falner and Rusk did to her, mistaking her for an unprotected civilian truck driver. Defense attorneys attempted to portray her as an agent who overstepped her authority, failed to coordinate properly with local law enforcement, and coerced her clients into illegal actions they would not normally commit. However, the deleted complaint files had refuted this narrative. Falner had not harassed Trina because she was a federal agent conducting an operation. He had harassed her because he always treated black women driving trucks through his county that way. This pattern was undeniable. It had been documented by years of suppressed complaints and by victims too terrified or powerless to resist. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered a verdict that would reshape the functioning of law enforcement accountability in rural America. Deputy Sheriff Clyde Falner was found guilty on all 23 charges, including attempted human trafficking, the deprivation of rights under the guise of the law, obstruction of justice, making false statements to federal investigators, and second-degree murder in the death of Rosa Martinez's daughter. The courtroom erupted. Rosa collapsed into her lawyer's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Marcus Chen closed his eyes and let the tears stream down his face. The other victims embraced one another and watched as justice was served, something they had been told would never come. Officer Rusk received similar sentences on 17 charges, fewer than Falner because he was a follower rather than a leader. But he will still spend decades in federal prison due to his role in the systematic abuse. Sheriff Clayton Marks was convicted on 14 counts related to obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and the systematic suppression of civil rights complaints. His attempts to claim he was unaware of his deputies' actions were refuted by emails showing he had instructed them to target specific individuals and personally deleted complaint files. Judge Henderson, tried in a separate case, was convicted of conspiracy and abuse of judicial authority, and ruling in favor of corrupt officials, was convicted of conspiracy and abuse of judicial authority. The verdict was handed down 2 months later in a packed courtroom where every seat was filled by the victims. Presiding federal judge Patricia Morrison reviewed the pre-sentencing reports with a methodical thoroughness that demonstrated her understanding of the historical weight of the moment. "Officer Falner," she began. Her voice carried the authority of one delivering a verdict that would resonate far beyond this courtroom. "You wore a badge meant to protect and serve. Instead, you used it as a weapon to terrorize, exploit, and destroy. You targeted vulnerable people because you believed your position made you untouchable. You joined a human trafficking ring that stole lives and destroyed families. And when a federal agent came to investigate your crimes, you attacked him, detained him illegally, and threatened him, all while recording devices documented every violation." He paused to let the impact of this assessment sink in. "The court finds these crimes particularly egregious because they were committed under the guise of the law. You did not merely break the law, you also violated the oath you swore to uphold it. This betrayal demands accountability commensurate with the power you abused." Falner stood expressionless, but Trina saw his hands trembling slightly. The court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the murder of Maria Martinez, an additional 25 years consecutively for the crime of attempted human trafficking, and a total of 40 more years consecutively for civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and other offenses. You will spend the rest of your life in custody and will never again possess the power to harm another human being. Shouts of disbelief and quiet sobs spread through the courtroom. Life in prison without parole. Falner would die in prison. His badge and authority would be stripped from him forever. Rusk's deputy received a 25-year federal prison sentence. Sheriff Marks received 20 years. Judge Henderson received 15 years and was permanently disbarred. But perhaps even more importantly, the Department of Justice announced that it had launched a comprehensive investigation into law enforcement practices in rural counties, focusing specifically on complaint handling, oversight mechanisms, and accountability systems. The Daniels Protocol was established. This new federal guidelines requiring that any complaint against law enforcement involving allegations of civil rights violations, racial discrimination, or abuse of authority be independently investigated. Civil rights organizations use this case as a catalyst to push for legislation mandating body cameras, establishing civilian oversight boards, and providing more comprehensive training on constitutional rights and de-escalation tactics. Trina, as she watched Falner being led away in handcuffs to serve his life sentence, thought of all the victims who had suffered in silence, those whose complaints were dismissed as trivial, who were ignored as troublemakers or liars, and who believed the system would never hold its corrupt officials accountable. Outside the courthouse, Rosa Martinez approached her as tears streamed down her face. "Thank you," she said simply. "My daughter never found justice while she was alive, but at least now the man who killed her can't hurt anyone else." Trina hugged her tightly, feeling the weight of every victim's story, every suppressed complaint, every life ruined by officials who believed their badges granted them immunity. "Your daughter mattered," Trina said. "Every victim mattered, and the system that left them in the lurch for so long finally worked. It's not perfect, it's not fast enough, but it worked." Marcus Chen joined them, along with other victims who had testified. They stood together outside the courthouse, a group of people who had been told their voices didn't matter, yet they had spoken and been heard. The media was swarming with questions, but Trina kept her statement brief. Justice doesn't stop just because someone wears a badge. It just takes longer to happen. But when it does, when the time for accountability finally comes, it shows that no one is above the law. Not police officers, not sheriffs, not judges, no one. As news crews broadcast this message nationwide, Trina felt that something had changed. It wasn't exactly a victory. Too many people had been hurt, too many lives ruined for it to feel like one. But it was vindication. Proof that systemic corruption could be exposed and punished, that victims' voices could overcome official denials, that patience and documentation could overcome what seemed like an unshakable power. Falner would spend the rest of his life in prison. By the time Rusk was released, he would be an old man. Marks would lose everything he had built through corruption. Henderson would never practice law again. And across the country, law enforcement agencies were forced to re-examine their own complaint procedures, their own accountability systems, and their own cultures, which could protect abusers rather than victims. The fight was not over. Corruption would continue to exist in various forms, but this case, these convictions proved that resistance was possible, documentation mattered, patience had paid off. Justice, however delayed, could still be achieved. 6 months after Agent Clyde Falner was sentenced to life in prison in federal court, Trina Daniels was sitting in Director Walsh's office at FBI headquarters. She held a carefully folded resignation letter in her hand. "You're one of our best agents," Walsh said, a look of sincere regret on his face. The Falner case was a textbook-quality covert operation, the kind of investigation that eliminates patient, disciplined, systematic corruption. "We need agents like you." Trina looked him straight in the eye. "The Bureau gave me the tools and training to fight injustice, and for that I will always be grateful. But over the past 6 months, I've come to realize something. The system works, we've proven that, but it moves far too slowly for people in immediate danger." She opened the letter and placed it on his desk. This decision had been brewing ever since she sat in that holding cell documenting civil rights violations while human trafficking victims were being taken away. While we were building the case against Falner, documenting patterns, obtaining search warrants, and coordinating with the courts, how many people became victims of human trafficking? How many victims were suffering while we were handling the paperwork? She shook her head. "I can't do this anymore. I need to work faster and more directly, without institutional constraints that prioritize procedure over urgent action." Walsh examined the resignation letter without touching it. "What are you going to do?" I'm going to start my own organization, Trina replied. Private security and rescue operations, fully licensed and legally authorized, will operate within the system but with more flexibility than federal bureaucracy allows. We'll take direct action when people are in danger, coordinate with law enforcement when appropriate, and provide victim services that don't require overcoming the government's bureaucratic hurdles. You'll need funding, operational support, and legal support, Walsh said. The FBI provides all that infrastructure. I've already found private donors, said Trina, former victims and their families who want to support rescue operations, civil rights organizations interested in accountability efforts, tech companies willing to fund surveillance equipment. The infrastructure is being set up. Walsh finally took the resignation letter in his hands and read it with the careful attention of someone who fully understood what it meant. The departure of an exceptional agent from federal service, a woman who had risked her life on a covert mission, now choosing to work outside the protection of the agency. Is this really what you want? He asked. This is what I have to do, Trina corrected him. The Bureau will continue its investigations into corruption and human trafficking. This work is vital, but I need to be on the front lines, making an immediate impact. I can't wait for the system to slowly move toward justice. She stood up and extended her hand. Thank you for everything, Director. For the training, the support, and the opportunity to serve. But the time has come to serve in a different way. Walsh shook her hand firmly, despite his obvious reluctance. If you change your mind, the door is always open, and if your organization ever needs to coordinate with the FBI on cases, you know who to call. Stepping out of headquarters for the last time as Special Agent Trina Daniels felt surreal, like shedding a skin that had defined her for years. But beneath that FBI identity was someone who existed before the Bureau and would continue to exist after it. Someone whose commitment to justice didn't require federal credentials to be legitimate and effective. The following months were spent building the infrastructure for second chance recovery and response. Registering as a legal business, obtaining a license for private security operations, establishing protocols that would ensure her work stayed within legal boundaries while preserving the flexibility she desired. The first person she hired was Miguel Diaz, a former Marine with combat medical training. He had been working in private security but wanted something more meaningful. The second was Sarah Chen, a former prosecutor who had resigned from the district attorney's office after witnessing numerous cases dismissed because victims had experienced severe trauma or were too afraid to testify. Slowly and carefully, they built a team: veterans with tactical training, former social workers specializing in trauma, and legal advisors who understood both criminal law and victim services. Each person was thoroughly vetted, rigorously trained, and dedicated themselves to the mission that drove Trina to rescue people in immediate danger, support their recovery, and coordinate with law enforcement when appropriate, all while ensuring that bureaucracy never delays life-saving actions. The organization's first case came 3 months after its founding. In Tennessee, a desperate mother called the helpline. Her teenage daughter had disappeared with someone she met online, and local police had classified it as a runaway case despite evidence pointing to human trafficking. Trina's team handled this case just as she had in hundreds of FBI investigations, but faster and more directly. Digital forensics tracked the online predator. Surveillance identified a house where numerous young women were being held. Legal coordination with local law enforcement secured search warrants and support. However, unlike FBI operations, which can take weeks to resolve jurisdictional issues and procedural requirements, Second Chance acted within 48 hours. By coordinating with cooperative local officers and executing search warrants accurately yet swiftly, they rescued 4 human trafficking victims, including the missing young girl, before the traffickers could relocate. The mother's tearful gratitude when her daughter returned became Trina's new measure of success. Not convictions, penalties, or systemic reforms, though those were important too, but immediate, tangible results. Lives saved, families reunited, second chances given to victims. By the end of 6 months, Second Chance had conducted 12 rescue operations across 4 states, rescued 31 victims, and coordinated with law enforcement on prosecutions that sent 7 human traffickers to prison. The organization's reputation spread rapidly. Victims' families reached out to receive the help that traditional systems couldn't or wouldn't provide. Law enforcement hired their services for special operations. As success stories proved the model's effectiveness, donors increased their funding. On a bright morning in late spring, Trina pulled the black Freightliner semi-truck, now redesigned as Second Chance's, Second Chance's mobile operations center, into a truck stop on Interstate 40. It wasn't the rest stop where Falner had arrested her, but it was similar enough to trigger memories that still weighed heavily, even though justice had been served. She stepped out of the cab. She was wearing the same style of tactical pants and slim-fit black shirt she preferred as an FBI agent. However, the badge on his belt now displayed Second Chance's credentials. licensed security contractor, authorized for rescue operations, legally permitted to work across state lines. His team gathered behind the truck, where the trailer had been converted into a mobile command center. While Miguel checked the communication equipment, Sarah reviewed the legal documents for the current operation. The other two team members, both former combat veterans with medical training, organized the tactical gear with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this countless times. Morning briefing in 5 minutes, Trina announced. Her voice carried the same calm authority it had during her FBI years. A radio was playing from a nearby maintenance bay, the morning news filtering through the static. Former Deputy Sheriff Clyde Falner's appeal was denied yesterday by the Federal Court of Appeals. His life sentence was upheld. In related developments, 3 more police officers linked to his smuggling ring were found guilty last week in Tennessee. Trina nodded slightly in satisfaction. The system was working, slowly but moving forward with the relentless momentum of documented evidence and public scrutiny. But she had learned that justice required both institutional power and direct action. Federal prosecutions were indispensable for systematic accountability, yet emergency rescue operations were equally indispensable to save lives that couldn't wait for bureaucratic processes. That's why she had founded Second Chance, to bridge the gap between institutional justice and urgent need. Target location confirmed, said Miguel, pointing to the map screen showing a warehouse 30 miles away. Our contractual status has been reported to local law enforcement. No jurisdictional issues. Sarah added, search warrants are clear. Judge Franklin personally approved them. We have full authority to go in and rescue the victims. Trina checked her equipment. Radio, bulletproof vest, first aid kit, recording devices. Everything was in place. Everything was by the book. She'd left the FBI, but she hadn't abandoned the discipline that made operations successful. A yellow school bus pulled into the parking lot and stopped briefly near the entrance to the truck stop. A young girl carrying a backpack covered in colorful badges jumped down the steps, one of the 4 victims they'd rescued during their first operation in Tennessee 6 months earlier. She saw Trina, recognized her, and waved enthusiastically. Her smile was bright and sincere, in a way that had seemed impossible when they first rescued her from the human trafficking house where she'd been held captive. Trina waved back. She remembered how this girl had curled up in terror in that basement, too traumatized to speak, and had convinced herself that no one cared enough to find her. She now lives with a foster family, attends a regular school, attending survivor support groups, and rebuilding the life that human trafficking had tried to destroy. Are you coming to the group tonight? The girl called out, referring to the survivor support program that Second Chance helps fund. I can't make it tonight, Trina replied, but I'll be there next week. Keep working on your history project. The girl smiled and ran back to the bus, toward a normal teenage life made possible by the rescue operations. Inside the mobile command center, Trina's team finished their final preparations. Everyone knew their role, responsibilities, and limits. There were no rogue operators. There were no uncontrolled individuals. Only trained professionals who carried out the necessary work within legal frameworks that allowed them to act faster than federal bureaucracy, yet demonstrated the same commitment to proper procedure. The radio continued with the morning news. Federal oversight programs have now begun implementation in 17 rural police departments across 6 states. Officials note that the Falner case has exposed systematic weaknesses in law enforcement accountability. Sarah grimaced and turned off the sound. I still can't believe corruption has gone this deep. That's why we're here, Trina replied. To make sure this doesn't happen again. To save people before they become statistics. To show that accountability and immediate intervention aren't mutually exclusive. Their organizations had moved beyond mere rescue operations. They were providing security for domestic violence shelters. They were training local law enforcement on proper procedures and constitutional rights. They were offering services to victims that didn't require dealing with government bureaucracy. Everything was clear and straightforward. Everything was documented. Everything operated within legal boundaries, yet the flexibility that made them effective was preserved. By the time preparations were complete, the morning sun had risen even higher. As other truckers passed by, many nodded respectfully at the Second Chance logo on their trailers. The organization's reputation had spread. They were known as those who did things right, those who rescued victims without causing additional trauma, those who worked with law enforcement, not against them, those who proved that private organizations could complement the government's efforts without replacing core institutional functions. Miguel checked his watch. Time to move out. Trina gathered her team for final instructions and explained the operation to them with the same methodical precision she used in FBI briefings. Safety first, full compliance with the law, complete documentation. No shortcuts, no compromises on standards, no actions that couldn't be defended in court if challenged. They had learned that justice works best in the light of day, and so had she. That working legally, transparently, with proper authority and oversight yields both immediate and sustainable results. A message chimed on Trina's phone. Another thank you message from a family they'd helped bring together last week. She set the message aside and focused on the task at hand. The thanks were meaningful, but the work itself was what truly mattered. The team loaded the cargo, secured the equipment, and approved the plans. Trina sat in the driver's seat and adjusted the mirrors with her usual ease. The engine roared to life, powerful, ready, and purpose-driven. She merged onto the highway and joined the morning traffic without a hitch. On the road, she was just another ordinary truck, but it carried a mission that had become more urgent and direct than her covert assignment at the FBI. The black truck passed the rest stop where Falner had arrested her 8 months earlier. The building looked the same. Tired travelers, scattered vehicles, the ordinariness of a place where an extraordinary injustice had occurred. But now everything was different. Falner was serving a life sentence without parole in a federal prison. Rusk was serving a 25-year sentence. Marks was serving a 20-year sentence. Thanks to Trina's patience and documentation, the human trafficking network they had protected had been dismantled. And she was driving that van not as an undercover agent trying to build a case, but as the director of an organization that rescues people in imminent danger, but as the director of an organization rescuing people in immediate danger. Both approaches were necessary. Both served justice. She had simply chosen to focus her energy on the area where she could make the most immediate difference. Her phone rang. It was Morrison from the FBI, no longer her supervisor but a regular point of contact for operational coordination. Trina, I wanted to let you know. Based on the intelligence you provided last month, we're executing search warrants today for a human trafficking operation in Mississippi. I thought you'd want to know that your surveillance work is still paying off. How many victims? She asked. We believe there are at least 6. Your pattern analysis helped us identify transport routes we'd missed. That's good work. After the call ended, Trina felt a familiar sense of satisfaction at seeing the investigations bear fruit. The FBI would take over the prosecution, build systematic cases, and ensure the human traffickers were sentenced to decades in prison. Second Chance, meanwhile, would handle emergency rescues, provide services to victims, and work on cases that couldn't wait for the federal schedule. The division of labor was working. Institutional power and direct action complemented each other rather than competing. As the van devoured the miles on the highway, Trina reflected on the journey from that rest stop arrest to this moment. From federal agent to private contractor. From a covert agent to the director of a rescue organization. From building cases to saving lives. The mission remained the same, to protect the vulnerable, hold abusers accountable, and demonstrate that justice is applied equally regardless of power or position. She had found a way to fulfill this mission with the urgency that institutional constraints had previously hindered. A crackle came over her radio. Miguel confirmed that all team members had taken their positions. Local law enforcement was standing by, search warrants had been executed, and they were ready. We're moving to the target location, Trina confirmed. Ensure operational security. Document everything. Follow protocol. The responses came back clear and professional. The team was ready. The mission was clear. Authority was being exercised legally and appropriately. Today they would save lives. Organized, professional, and legally authorized private security forces, working alongside federal law enforcement, could combat human trafficking more comprehensively than they could on their own. 8 months ago, when he had thrown her onto that truck, Deputy Sheriff Falner had tried to teach her a lesson about knowing her place. Instead, Special Agent Trina Daniels, now Director Trina Daniels, had taught the world a lesson about the price of assuming that power, accountability, and badges grant immunity from justice. As an FBI agent, she had fought corruption from within the system, patiently documenting systematic abuses that led to life sentences. Now, as a rescue operator outside the system, she was fighting human trafficking and making life-saving emergency interventions while federal cases were ongoing. Both roles were important, both served justice. Both proved that refusing to accept injustice, whether in uniform or in civilian clothes, could create change that extended far beyond individual victories. The black van continued down the highway, carrying a team dedicated to second chances and swift action, working in the sunlight, not the shadows, proving that justice does not stop at institutional boundaries. Falner was in prison. The network had been dismantled. Victims were being rescued, survivors were healing, reforms were being implemented, and Trina Daniels was exactly where she needed to be, fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, using the tools and training provided by the FBI, yet possessing the flexibility to act faster when lives were at stake. The fight wasn't over, it would never be completely over. But every victim rescued, every human trafficker imprisoned, every corrupt official held accountable, proved that this fight was worth continuing. A truck, a team, a single mission, every time. Justice was achieved not through badges or IDs claiming authority, but through actions that delivered results. That was the real lesson. It wasn't about whether the system worked or not, but about how working within the system, alongside it, and sometimes ahead of it, created the comprehensive approach required to address systemic issues. The truck vanished into traffic, indistinguishable from thousands of others, carrying people determined to ensure that what happened at that rest stop and to countless victims over years of corruption would occur less frequently, immediately, legally, effectively, and that changed everything.